Everybody, this is Perch. Um, I, I, uh, okay, so this video is about just relaxing and having fun at its core. That's what this video is about. So, one of the things I think is a problem for comic books and writers and people who are trying to craft stories is in a weird way, they're trying to be too serious about what it is that they're doing. And as a result, they've kind of forgotten about just how to have fun and put out something that is a good book or a good story or a good plot or whatever else. And the idea of having fun means I mean, by its nature, you don't have to be serious about it. If you look back at a lot of the old comic books and some of the stories that all of us love, they don't make a lot of sense. If you really take a very kind of strict, no fun, analytical look at it, the stories do not make sense. Okay, so the Infinity Gauntlet story that was fun. You've got a purple alien coming in to gather a bunch of magic stones that when he wishes it, half the people disappear. He's evil, but he doesn't think to make like his enemies disappear. He's just making like it would have been very easy for me to, or for me. Sorry, that's a little bit of an internal wish there, but it'd been very easy for Thanos to say, I want half the people in the world to disappear and make sure that the half that disappear are also the people who could stop me that are my enemies. Like, just add a couple words there and your plan is solid. But he doesn't do that. And as a result, shenanigans, right? So, comics don't make sense. And the great stories in our life do not make sense if you take a literal, hard, logical view of things. It's better to be fun. I'll briefly tie this into kind of the real world. CNN has, with the election of Donald Trump, which has just occurred, CNN is making a lot of comments in their articles about how there's been an unprecedented darkest day in American history on January 6, 2021. This is the day of the people who stormed the Capitol. And if you're listening to this right now, and I'm, please, if you will, whether you're right leaning or left leaning, whether you're Republican or Democrat, I want you to put into perspective the words darkest, one of the darkest days in American history. Okay, so, if you're opposed to that, and keep in mind, from my perspective, and every now and then people accuse me of being far right, people accuse me of being far left. I would never portray the January 2021 events as being one of the darkest days in American history. I don't know how many darkest days you're talking about. You're talking about like the top 10. Sorry, audio issue there. Are you talking about the top 10,000 days in American history? Is that what we're talking about here? Because if you're talking about the top 10,000 days, I don't know, maybe a political rally where people stormed the cap, and stormed is again a triggered word, but people wandered into the Capitol and then kind of wandered around where there was some, passive violence. What are we talking about? But if you see in an article one of the darkest days in American history, what springs to mind for me is like Pearl Harbor, events during the Civil War, 9/11, the Oklahoma City, Trade Center bombing, like that. That's the kind of stuff that springs to mind. I don't even think it was this many, but like 1,000 people fucking around the Capitol. It doesn't rise to the occasion of darkest days in human history, American history, and yet this is how it's portrayed. And so CNN's like, well, Trump will be now elected and he'll be certified on one of, the anniversary of one of the darkest days in human history. And it doesn't make any goddamn sense because, you like a thing that always springs to my mind is Pearl Harbor. And why it springs to mind is, my grandfather was on a ship in Pearl Harbor. Now, obviously he survived. But he describes that thing as like a horror show. I mean, like friends of his dying, ships being blown up, like that was a nightmare for him. And so the idea that that somehow the January 6th event is one of the darkest days in human history, to me, always what comes to mind is, well, Pearl Harbor was worse, like a lot worse, like not even in the same universe as worse. And then I was looking this up, and I'll read this to you. And I promise this is coming back to comics. This is not meant to be political. But it says, like, this is an actual article from CNN. It says Kamala Harris will endure one of the most humbling experiences in U.S. politics on January 6th, but also one of the most important functions in the peaceful transfer of power. On one of the darkest days in all of America history, Donald Trump's supporters stormed the Capitol. Other moments, like I'm literally reading here, other moments where the vice president has had to endure hardship include: in 1861, Vice President John Breckinridge, who lost the 1860 election, oversaw the counting of electoral votes that made Abraham Lincoln president at a time when Southern states seceded from the country rather than accept his victory. And I just want to put it in perspective. However you feel about the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021, no state succeeded from the goddamn country. Like that, those are not in the same universe of darkest days in American history. There's a time when states in America said, fuck it, we're out. And we had a war over that. That is like thousands and thousands of people were killed. Those are not the same. So now if I can bring it back to comics for a moment. Comic books need to be fun. No, I mean, what I mean by that is I think a lot of writers in comics are trying to kind of make their mark. And the fallacy in this is you're trying to make their mark as being one of the most important comic stories in all of history. And what they're missing is that the right answer is to be a fun comic story, a comic story that in the moment makes people happy, that makes people enjoy what they're reading. Because if I look at history shows that comic books that are fun and engaging and that you like to read and like to buy, tend to do better in history than comic books that are trying to be important. Trying to be a great moment in history is next to impossible. Just like it's impossible for any serious person, for anyone. I'm sorry, there is no world where anyone can argue that the events of January 6, 2021 have more relevance than Pearl Harbor or states seceding from the Union or the Civil War or thousands of people, losing their life when a plane hit a building in New York. Those are not the same. And so to say they're the same and to, conflate those two or to over-enhance those two is just ridiculous. It is stupid. And quite frankly, that if you're a Democrat and you're listening to this, and I'm glad you are, that's why your side lost the election, is because you said dumbass things like that. And keep in mind, I am not, for all you Republicans out there like, Perch has finally picked a side. No, your side has done dumb shit too. Don't exaggerate. Just like in comics, exaggeration is death. Hyperbole is death. You cannot inflate these things. You cannot set out, if you're trying to write a good comic story, you cannot set out with the goal of, I'm going to write the most important comic story of all time. You cannot set out with that goal. If you do, you lose. I don't look. I read articles today, and I read hype and interviews with comic writers. And right now, one of the biggest ones, and I'm not sure exactly why, and this is not a knock against him, but Dennis Camp, who's doing the Ultimates, is getting a lot of attention in comics press. Is like, you're writing the most important comic series of all time in the Ultimates, and to me, that's a death sentence for the comic. That only hurts the ability that comic is not going to be successful if it's called the most important comic of all time. Because number one, it's not. It's easily forgettable. In 10 years, people are not going to be remembering the Ultimates fondly or at all. Like, hell, I won't even go, they won't be remembered good or bad. It won't be remembered at all. Hopefully, Dennis Camp has written another 500 comics or whatever, and he's continued to get better. He's one of the cornerstones in all of Marvel and DC and Independence, and he's putting out amazing shit. I hope so. I mean, fuck, I hope that is true. But if you set out to say, like, to me, as soon as a comic news site or a podcast or anyone else talks about your comic being, the most critical comic of our time, it sends a message of your comic sucks. It's never like, at what point, and by the way, if you're old enough to remember this, when Watchmen came out, people were not calling it the most important comic of our time. And yet it's done well over the years. It's sold great work. It's been interesting. It makes money. You cannot set out to be the most important thing of all time. You need to set out to be fun. You need to set out to be entertaining. And this is the cornerstone. I understand this probably sounds like a drunken rambling. I promise I am not drunk. This is a cornerstone behind all comics and success. You need to be fun. You need to be entertaining. You need to make people feel good about the time they spend reading your book and doing your, basically giving you their time or their money. The second you set out to be important, you fail. I'll bring him up because I bring him up a lot. I've done interviews with Jim Zub over the course of several of his different series. The absolute most fun he's having, and I had lunch with Zub, and he was alive. He's always been an enjoyable person to talk to, but when I had lunch with him, he was arm deep into Conan, and the guy was alive. He was having the time of his life, and I think this is his most successful book, is Conan. And there's a clear parallel there. If you're having fun, if you're having the time of your life, if you're doing work that means something to you, that you're enjoying, that you're genuinely passionate about, it tends to work. It tends to be a fun read. It tends to be successful. That's it. Anyway. People who have fun get rewarded. Maybe not on day 1, maybe not on day 20, but eventually. If you're having fun, if you're writing comics that are fun, if you're trying to entertain, and that is your number one goal, not picking online fights, not being a douche, not trying to write the most important thing in the history of the world because you got something to say, not trying to insert your own bullshit agendas into the comic because that's what's important. If you're having fun, you win. The end. And what do you think?